Emulation. The ability to trick your computer or console into believing that it's something it's not, and then by doing so allowing it to run software, or to be more specific for this topic, video games, aka ROMs, on that computer or console, more often than not, illegally.
FBI, open up!
The first ever emulator, as far as we know, was created by Yuji Naka, the creator of one of video games' most iconic characters, Sonic the Hedgehog. On at least 2 separate occasions, Yuji Naka has admitted to getting NES games to run on a Sega Mega Drive. How do you people know about that one? Well, yeah, actually I did. I did it primarily for study purposes. I ran things like Dr. Mario, although it did not work perfectly. Actually, it was something fun to amuse myself with at the time. This takes us all the way back on our emulation journey to the year of 1991. And although of course this wasn't ever publicly released, and of course the idea of emulation had been with us for the longest time, especially on systems like the Amiga and even further back the ColecoVision, as far as true software-based emulation is concerned that doesn't require any additional hardware, if Yuji Naka is telling the truth, and let's say he is, then this was the start of it all, and from here on out it was way more common. In 1992, Amiga owners were able to download and play Game Boy games on their system, and a year later a Mac emulator too. By this point, Sega Mega Drive games were being shared freely on message boards across the internet, and one of those quote-unquote boards was called Mafia, a board that required a fee from its users and a very brief background check, cause you never know, you might be the popo.
FBI, open up!
But what makes this board different than most is that the guys running it were also running a business. Sure, membership fees for boards made for sharing more obvious and expected internet interests were pretty common back then, but when it comes down to Mafia, they wasn't just sharing content, they were acting as a shop too. This is the Super Magic Drive, a device used to not only play Genesis ROMs on your Sega system, but also copy them too. And if you were one of the lucky enough kids who parents got them everything, come on, we all remember those kids.
Dave, we got your golden axe.
Then you could buy this device from the company that ran this board, and after buying it, you could download a small selection of ROMs for rental purposes. Like for instance, Jurassic Park and Sonic Spinball, just as long as you deleted them after a day or two. Obviously, nobody deleted those ROMs, and even though it was expected that all of the members would delete their ROMs after a couple of days, it wasn't actually stated anywhere on the board that you needed to do this. And therefore, when a Sega employee secretly entered the room, it was more than easy to see what was going on and take the owners to court, which Sega did, and obviously they won. It wasn't exactly a huge case compared to what's coming up in this video, as the owners of said boards only had to pay $10,000 plus attorney fees for losing against Sega. And this was because there was just no way to prove whether or not said owners updated these ROMs themselves or the customers did. Either way, as small of a fine as this was, it was the start of video game companies going up against individuals that provided platforms for random people on the internet to be able to download their games and play them illegally. However, before Sony got involved and started throwing their weight around, by this point in time, emulation had become way more mainstream. In 1994, we got our first Mega Drive / Genesis emulator. In 1995, Activision were the first to officially emulate their games in a compilation called Activision Classics for Windows 3.1. We see the birth of MAME, which brought arcades home in 1996, and we also saw SNES 9X, the first ever Super Nintendo emulator, the same year too. In 1997, we got our first ever fan-translated ROM with Final Fantasy V for SNES emulators, and in 1998, the retro emulation scene rejoiced when the never-before-released Q*bert sequel was officially released into the public domain. Which brings us up to date and back to Sony. Now, the PlayStation 1 emulation scene had already been around for a few years by this point, but it never really bothered Sony as it wasn't exactly that great. Plus, considering you needed a PC and a technical know-how on how to actually run these games, as far as Sony was concerned, it just wasn't worth their time. That was until two companies came along and brought emulation to the masses by selling emulation to the masses. Connectix were first up with their product, the Virtual Game Station, a company that had been playing around with this sort of thing for years, giving Mac owners the ability to run Windows software beforehand. But what makes this emulator different than ones that have come before is that Connectix tried to go to Sony and legitimately release this emulator. They set up a meeting with Sony and showed them Crash Bandicoot running on a Mac. However, in order for this to work, Connectix needed to use Sony PlayStation's official BIOS. And for those of you out there that don't understand what a BIOS is, it's essentially the basic input and output system. In other words, your computer or console has a chip attached to the motherboard that includes a basic input that's going to run before anything else. On your PC, for instance, if the BIOS doesn't start up first, Windows isn't going to follow. So in turn, on a PlayStation or any other console for that matter, if the BIOS isn't loading up beforehand, your game isn't going to load up either. And that's why when you download an emulator, it's not going to include the BIOS files. That's up to you to go and find those BIOS files, and unless you have some kind of backhanded deal going on with Sony, you're going to have to do that illegally. And this is why that meeting was just so important. Without Sony's permission to use their custom BIOS, it wasn't going to happen. Or at least, that's what Sony thought. They straight up said no to Connectix's offer, which resulted in Connectix doing the unthinkable, making their own BIOS. Eventually, this software was released and even revealed by Steve Jobs himself, and you guessed it, even though it sold fairly well at just under $50. Remember, this was $19.99 and Sony themselves was only just dropping the PlayStation 1 to just below $100. Sony came a-running with a lawsuit, because of course they did. They literally told them that they can't do this very thing. And the long and short of it is that Sony lost. Or did they? For a short while leading up to the court case, Connectix lost the ability to actually sell the product, making these once legal software packages now illegal. And even though this emulator was different, as out of the box it could only run legitimate game discs for a specific region before hackers come along and fix that, for a short while the emulator itself became the pirated software as opposed to the games. Anyway, as stated, eventually Sony lost the case as Connectix proved that they didn't use any of Sony's code to make their emulator, resulting in Sony, after failing again to stop them, eventually just did a Bob Iger and bought the Virtual Game Station themselves, and then immediately destroyed the Virtual Game Station. Because, of course they did. The fight against Sony and Connectix is one of the most important fights in all of emulation history, as it legitimized the ability for people out there to create emulators by reverse engineering the systems they're making emulators for. But again, just as long as the BIOS is not included. Now you may be thinking, why is this such a big deal? Don't console manufacturers lose money when selling consoles? And the answer is yes. Virtually no money, and in some cases a loss, is made by the biggest video game manufacturers when selling their own consoles, as the real money comes in via the games themselves, with Sony in this example earning a little bit of dough every single time you purchase a new game. What you got to understand is that the only way you're going to get your game on a Sony PlayStation is by Sony allowing you to do that very thing. In other words, you're not going to be able to get past that BIOS without Sony allowing you. However, in an alternative timeline where the Connectix system is freely available and equally successful, game developers no longer need to pay Sony a fee to get past the BIOS, because that BIOS had been rewritten. Around the same time, Sony was fighting a far more well-known battle against Bleem, yet another commercially released emulator that not only played PlayStation games, it enhanced them too. Plus eventually it was released on Sega's Dreamcast as well as a PC. And sure, by this point the real competition was actually between the PlayStation 2 and the Dreamcast, seeing previously PlayStation 1 exclusive classics looking better than ever on the competitor's system was surely gonna sting. Again, this is by far the most well-known court case when it comes to emulation history, so I'm not going to go into super nitty-gritty detail, but the long and short of it is that even though Sony was losing in court, once again, they went to the stores that were selling Bleem and refused to send them Sony products if they continued to sell Bleem, which of course some retailers did. This along with the fact that Bleem for Dreamcast, or Bleemcast if you will, wasn't exactly as exciting as originally hoped, being that each disc could only emulate one specific PlayStation game, which resulted in the death of the company. From this point on, emulation had become so widespread that more and more emulators were getting released almost on a monthly basis, including ones for systems that were so small and niche, well, that didn't matter. And even though Nintendo are arguably the most well-known big company offering up legitimate ways to play ROMs via the Virtual Console on the Wii, it was actually Sega that started this craze when they teamed up with NEC at the start of the millennium and released the Dream Library, exclusively in Japan for the Dreamcast. The Dream Passport free disc held the emulators, and the online service allowed you to download them for a small fee. Sadly, with the death of the Dreamcast looming above, this service was never released on Western shores. But to be fair, that's not a bad thing, as supposedly the emulation quality was on par with the Sega Smash Pack and may just be the worst officially released emulation that I have ever seen. But of course, let's not kid ourselves, it was Nintendo that absolutely dominated the official emulation scene with the release of the Virtual Console. And they were also the company that absolutely dominated in court against the pirates. As easy as it was to find an emulator for practically any system imaginable, it was even easier to find the games, aka the ROMs, for that particular system. And in the early 2000s, a whole heap of ROM sites popped up online that gave their audience exactly that. Sure, most of them were filled to the brim with pop-ups and viruses, but amongst all the rubble, you had two very popular sites that stood out, and they were Love ROMs and Emu Paradise. Praised by the emulation community and loathed by the video game giants, in Nintendo's eyes, the Virtual Console is offering up a good chunk of their back catalogue legally, so sites like these are even more illegal now than ever before. And because of this, of course, Nintendo took them to court. And boy, oh boy, did they win. Well, actually, to tell the truth, this case never made it to court. After Nintendo lawyers slapped down proof of 40 instances of copyright infringement due to the 140 illegal ROMs that they own the copyrights to, resulting in a cool $100 million in damages claim. And because of this, the husband and wife team that ran Love ROMs presumably needed to buy some new undergarments. And obviously, this husband and wife team didn't fancy going up against Nintendo, especially considering their only counter-argument was that they provided the platform that heavily promoted Nintendo ROMs. So they settled out of court to the tune of $12.23 million and a public apology too. Gone was the super nostalgic Nintendo-themed website, including Mario backdrop and icons, and of course the long list of games mostly featuring Nintendo's most iconic retro titles. As from late 2018, that all vanished, and in its place we had nothing but the following message. Apology to Nintendo. Our websites loveroms.com, loveretro.co previously offered and performed unauthorized copies of Nintendo games. games in violation of Nintendo's copyrights and trademarks. LoveRoms.com/LoveRetro.co acknowledges that it caused harm to Nintendo, its partners and customers by offering infringing copies of Nintendo games and has agreed to cease all such activities. To access legitimate Nintendo games online, please visit www.nintendo.com for more information about the Nintendo Game Store. And then several months later, that website completely vanished. Emu Paradise, arguably the second biggest ROM site on the internet, decided to follow suit too. They removed all of their Nintendo ROMs because it just wasn't worth the risk. I cannot, in good conscience, risk the future of our team members who have contributed to the site through the years. We run Emu Paradise for the love of retro games and for you to be able to revisit these good times. Unfortunately, it's not possible right now to do so in a way that makes everyone happy and keeps us out of trouble. And I'm sure you will all agree that this was Nintendo's goal all along. The people that run these sites are in most cases just a few people, making money from advertising by freely distributing that they do not own or have the authorization to do so. Did the LoveROM guys ever pay that $12 million? I doubt it. Not to the full extent at least. But honestly, who knows? No updates have ever come since that date. But if you're Nintendo, who cares? You just succeeded in not only taking down one of the biggest players in the scene, but you also took down the second biggest too by scaring the scene. It's a court case that even though now it's half a decade later, the ripples can still be felt. Sure, ROM sites do still exist, but for the uneducated, it is a tad harder to find respectable sites that offer up Nintendo ROMs. Is that a good thing? Many believe that LoveROMs and similar sites were providing a service to the masses that the big companies were failing to do themselves. In a world of only officially licensed emulation, if you want to play some of the rarest games ever released on the NES, for instance, the only way to do so is by buying them on eBay. Not only does this not provide Nintendo with any money whatsoever, but it's going to cost the buyer upwards of $1,000 a piece easily. ROM sites allowed gamers to experience these titles that in a lot of cases are never going to see the light of day. And for Nintendo, it showed off their incredibly rich history. How many Pokemon fans, for instance, are buying new Pokemon games because they discovered older Pokemon games via ROMs and emulation that for a time Nintendo didn't officially release publicly? My guess is quite a few. However, the fact of the matter is that these ROM sites and the people that download the ROMs illegally simply do not have the authorization to do so. It may sting, but that is a fact. Leave your comments down below and let me know your thoughts on not only this brief history of emulation, ROMs and piracy, but also your suggested solution moving forward. And also, why not go check out supporters.slopesgameroom.com, a directory for everything related to the show, see plenty of exclusive videos, see everything I've ever released in its uncut, unsponsored and uncensored form with early versions and making ofs for most main videos, plus a whole load more too available to all patrons and YouTube members that support the show for as little as you wish. Just like all of the names that you see at the bottom of this screen, everyone you see down there support the show and so many more. So this is the part of the video where I give a massive thank you, a massive shout out to all of the following Patreons: Ye Old Hamburglar, Wobbles and Bean the Wonder Ducks, Vike Echo, Vitas Varnes, Todd Paul Float G, The Sneaky Ferret, That Gamer, Steven, Shadow Dragon, Shade Silence, Scott Harvey, Sir Nilsson, Ryan Burford, Richard Alderjick, Ray Blair, Roll VP, Over Giles Zane, Nicholas Burtner, Mind of the Unsane, Mike Fallon, Mac Jackson, Kat Layton, John Rogers, Jeff Mianowski, James, Jabba Al Aiden, Jay is Manchild, Ian Quell, Derakuda, Dina81, Dina, The Action Saxon, Conrad Constantine, Clan Bob, Chev Matic, Casey Samples, Bram Perez, Boots and Pup, Benjamin Guy, Arista, Andrew Dalton and Akatimo84. Thank you to all of you guys for all of your support, and thank you to all of you guys for watching the video. I'm really interested interested to see what you say down below about all of the emulation and the piracy of the past. Let me know down below your thoughts on all of that. And yeah, if you like this video, the best thing you can do definitely is just share it around on Discord, on Reddit, any kind of social media. All that stuff really helps more than you know. But anyway, guys, until next time, this is DJ Slope signing out, and hopefully I'll see you all next time. Bye bye.